We can to try to make this space welcoming and engaging for you to the best of our ability. I want to just introduce you and welcome you all to the space. Personally, I will say that I was very inspired and moved by the protests that happened in Cal Poly Humboldt in the spring. I was very much connected to the threads and the pain of the deaths in Gaza. I think tonight's conversation is very much driven by a desire to continue honest, compassionate, and sincere dialogue and conversation.
I apologize. I'm going to invite everyone to imagine a map of the region. And that's a good stretch of our brains. And Kathy's going to lead us through a quick mini lecture. They'll give us some answers to the questions. Who controls the Middle East? Who pays the bills? What is the geopolitical context of this terrible war going on now? So please welcome Professor Lee.
The Middle East. There it is. Okay. Well, good evening. I encountered an essay recently that was written by a journalist by the name of Amanda Scoggins, who wrote a book about the conflict in the Sudan. And she said, if you look at the Sudan and you look at it as a map, there's a layer on top of the history. And if you peel that layer away, there's a layer underneath of the current political conflict. And if you peel that away, there's the religious conflict between the Muslims in the north and the Christians and animists in the south. And if you peel that away, there's linguistic and cultural differences. And if you peel that layer away, there's the economic disparity between these two regions. So she said that each time you add a new layer to the conflict, you don't get rid of the layers that were there underneath. You just add to it. So there's an endless opportunity for continuing conflict. Tonight, I want to talk about just one of those layers, which is the history of how the modern Middle East was created. And so when we look at history, one of the famous quotes from the Holocaust historian, Lucy Davidovich, was, "We look at the past through the prism of the present, and we try to discern the future." So a prism bends the light, and the present tends to shape the way that we look at the past, often to support our positions in the present. And in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's a lot of really strong distortions of that prism. And so just to introduce that, I'd like to talk about some of those. One of the distortions you hear all the time, and I hear this from people all the time, these people have been fighting for centuries. That's not true. This conflict is about 100 years old. It emerges after World War I, and that's really what I kind of want to focus on today. Because it's very important to see that the conflict was not caused by the people who lived there. The conflict was caused by outside forces who sought to control the people who lived there. So that's one myth. The other myth is there's no such thing as a Palestinian or Palestine. Golda Meir famously said, there's no such thing as a Palestine, there's nobody we can give the land back to. That's not true. The people who lived in this area identified themselves as Palestinians. When the British mandate was established there, what they called it was the British Mandate for Palestine. And there's a difference between nations and states that we'll talk about in just a minute. It kind of explains that confusion. The last one is the saying, it was a land with no people for a people with no land. And that's also not accurate, because there were about 750,000 people there at the time of World War I. And what happened is a state was created for a traumatized people that in turn traumatized the indigenous population where that state came to be located. So 3 myths that tend to distort the way that we look at the conflict. So, sovereignty. A lot of the conflict can be explained by this term that we call sovereignty. Sovereignty means that that people in a specific geographic area have the ability to control what happens within that area and to protect themselves from outside entities interfering with that. Today, as we'll see, there's a lot of variety in the Middle East as to who has sovereignty and who doesn't. There's a lot of interference in the countries from outside forces that exacerbate the conflict. The conflict in the Middle East can be seen really as a quest for sovereignty after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. You know, one of the myths of these people have been fighting for centuries, is that this area was really not an area of conflict. For hundreds of years, it was mostly just a backwater of the Ottoman Empire. It was important for religious tourism because there were holy sites for all 3 Abrahamic religions. But it wasn't particularly strategic. It wasn't all that important economically. And so there wasn't a lot of conflict there. The people simply went about their lives. Okay? So, the difference between nations and states. A nation is a group of people who have a collective identity, who occupy a certain region. A state is a permanent set of institutions with defined borders. A nation-state is a combination of both. So, an example of a nation is the Navajo Nation, occupying a specific area with a common culture. The Ottoman Empire was a state, but it was a state that included many, many nations. Okay? And a nation-state, again, is what the modern construct is. So when people say there was never a Palestine, there was never a Palestinian state prior to World War II. Just listen. But there was a Palestinian nation. The other point is, there was not an Iraq, there was not a Syria, there was not a Lebanon, there was not a Kuwait, there was not a Saudi Arabia, and there wasn't an Israel. Right? So nations are not the same as states. And so you can't erase the people by saying, well, you don't have a state. Because after World War I, the European powers carved up the Middle East and created these states. Right? 2 groups of people were left out. One of them occupies northern Iraq, northern Syria, and southeast Turkey. Anybody know who that is? The Kurds. Okay? Didn't get a state. Has been fighting to get a state ever since. The other one was the Palestinians. And it wasn't convenient either for the surrounding Arab countries or for Britain to have a Palestinian state. So, nations and states. So the British, well, the Irish have a saying, my people. God doesn't, the sun never sets on the British Empire because God doesn't trust the Brits in the dark. And during World War I, Britain was fighting against the Ottoman Empire because the Ottoman Empire was allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And they wanted to open up a second front, particularly after their disastrous campaign in Gallipoli. And they decided that they wanted to convince the Arabs to fight with them against the Ottomans. And so they went to the Emir of the Hijaz, Emir Hussein, who controlled the western part of the Arabian Peninsula. And they said in the McMahon-Hussein correspondence in 1915 and 1916, if you fight with us, we will help you establish an Arab kingdom in all of these areas where the Arabs live in the Middle East. And we'll call it the Hashemite Kingdom of Arabia. On your handout, there's a map of this. It was everything other than Lebanon was going to be this thing. Now, the Emir had 2 sons, Faisal and Abdullah. Faisal fought with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and he ended up being installed by the British as the king of Iraq. His brother Abdullah was installed in Jordan as the king of Jordan. In fact, today, the current king Abdullah of Jordan is the great-great-grandson of the Emir of the Hijaz, and Jordan is called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So it traces it back to this period of time. So at the same time that they promised the Arabs that they would have this Arab state, they wanted to get the support of European Jews to support it as well. So they started negotiating with the Jewish population in Europe to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And we see that in a document that's called the Balfour Declaration in 1917. The negotiations happened before that. So they wanted the Arabs for two reasons. First of all, they needed the manpower. But they also wanted to not have the Ottomans say that this is a holy war between Christianity and Islam. And having the emir who controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina would help them in that process. They also wanted the support of the Jewish population, not only in Great Britain and the Allies, but also in the Axis powers, and forming a Jewish homeland. Now, the British never had any intention of creating a Jewish state. They wanted a homeland for the Jewish people. They planned to control it all themselves. Because meanwhile, so we've got the Arab promise, we've got the Jewish promise, and now we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is an agreement between the French and the British, with the Italians and the Russians along for the ride, to carve up the Middle East for themselves. And they were going to end, so France was going to control what became Syria and Lebanon, and the British were going to control the rest of it, including they'd have direct control over the Persian Gulf, where they had just discovered large quantities of petroleum. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement was secret, but it came out in the communists, the Bolsheviks, released it when they got a copy of it. And after World War I, there's this push for self-determination, to say nations should have their own state. So they say, okay, we're going to create these states. We're going to have Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, right? But you're not ready, right? So you have this period, it's called the mandates. And during the mandates, they said, well, you have a king, right? You have this country, but you're not ready. I kind of think of mandates as training wheels for nation states. And so they said, we're going to control things until you're ready. And that was the status of these countries until after World War II. If you look at the map that's on the handout that shows the dates of independence, you find that it happens after World War II for most of these countries, where they really had independence. And that's because after World War II, especially after the UN Charter, it's not okay to be a colonial power. And you see this period of decolonization. So, as a result of that, and particularly with the movement of people to Palestine from Europe, you begin to see some stresses emerge in the area. Now, when we talk about Zionists, in this case, Zionists today can end up being used as a pejorative. I'm not using it that way. This was a movement that started in the late 1800s, where European Jews said, we will never assimilate completely into Gentile society. The only thing that we can do is find a Jewish homeland. And so this was a political movement at that time to establish that homeland. Now, prior to World War I, the Jewish population in Palestine was less than 10%. By 1930, it's about 16%. And at the time of independence, it's about 30%. So as the people began to move in, it starts to cause stresses and strains in the society. Very often the land was held, they were tenant farmers or tenant renters for absentee landlords. And so land would be bought, houses would be bought, people would be evicted from their land and from their houses, and you start to see conflicts emerge in the population. Now, this is the time where the British are in charge there, right? And so the British try to settle this down with a variety of ways of saying, well, we'll divide this territory between the Palestinians and the Jewish populations. The first one was called the Peel Commission in 1937, where and there's a map there of that. The Jewish population said that they accepted this division of the area, but Ben-Gurion made it really clear, and this is really well documented, that the plan was to accept the partition and then move to annex the rest of Palestine. The British finally gave up. They gave up particularly after terrorists blew up their headquarters in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. Those were Jewish terrorists from the Irgun movement, and they said, we're leaving, we've had it with this. And the UN said, well, let's come up with a different way of doing partition. And in that case, again, the Jewish population supported it because it gave international recognition to the Jewish state. The Arabs opposed it because they said, we're not getting the percentage of the land that reflects our percentage of the population. Also, we're not getting the best land in terms of its productive value for agriculture and things like that. So they said, we're not accepting this. The surrounding Arab powers did not accept it because they said, we don't want the Europeans coming in and telling us how we should run things and making these decisions for us, because that's essentially what was happening. These things did not really involve the people that were there. It tended to be people from the outside making these proposals as to how this should work. Now, after the British left, the British ended the mandate. The day after the British ended the mandate, Israel declared its independence. And it's at that point that we see another layer in this conflict. And that's the Nakba, the displacement of the Palestinian population in the lands that were considered to be, that was going to be the state of Israel, which was far more than either partition plan had proposed. There were about 750,000 people who were forced out of their homes. About 15,000 people were killed. The Arab states attacked Israel. Israel repelled those attacks. Those newly formed states did not have well-organized military. And then at that point, anyone who tried to come back to get their land or to get their homes or to get some of their possessions was forced back out of the country. So one of the statuses that we see today with this is the people that were displaced at that time do not have the ability to come back to Palestine. And that is the so-called right of return. That's one of the contentious aspects of this. So at that point, there are more conflicts with the surrounding Arab countries. There's the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. There's other flare-ups on border skirmishes. But things went along that way until 1967 and the Six-Day War in 1967. At that point, the West Bank, which had been part of Jordan, was occupied. The Golan Heights, which had been part of Syria, was occupied. And the Gaza Strip, which had been part of Egypt, was occupied, along with the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt in the 1980s in the agreement between Egypt and Israel. But this is kind of where the origins of this conflict are. And it's something that doesn't really come up in our discussions of it But in the same way that I said, we look at the past through the prism of the present and try to discern the future, it's that distortion of the history of the creation of these states that causes this problem. If we look today in this question of sovereignty, there are some countries in the area that really are sovereign countries. Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Arab Emirates, they're all, Turkey's moving towards authoritarianism. The other ones are all authoritarian governments. There are states which have to contend with outside interference that really hampers their ability to control what's happening in their country. In the case of Lebanon, you have there was a huge Syrian occupation there for a long period of time. Syria left, but Iran has moved into that. And an Iranian-backed militia called Hezbollah operates in the southern part of Lebanon. Syria has a large presence of Russians and a large presence of Iranians. Iraq has a large presence of the United States. There are still U.S. forces in Iraq. And also, Iran is an influence there. So you can't really say that those countries are sovereign because they don't really control everything that's happening there. They're at the mercy of these other countries coming in. And if you look at Israel, Israel is often defined as the only democracy in the Middle East. If you look at Israel proper, 20% of the population is Palestinian. They face what we call de jure and de facto discrimination. Their identities cards identify them as Palestinian. They are limited in the roles that they can fill in society, and they face a tremendous amount of discrimination. They also face way, way less per capita investment in their schools and infrastructure. But for Palestinians in the West Bank, they are in small enclaves that are separated by Jewish settlements that began in 1967 and have accelerated greatly since that period of time. There are checkpoints. If you want to go from Nablus to Bethlehem, you have to go through multiple checkpoints. And so with all of those things, this is not a democracy for the people in the occupied territories. And that is why you have this continuing tension there. There's always a reason for that. Okay? So, I want to leave some, do we have time for some questions? Okay. I realize that's a lot, and it's hard to sort of narrow things down to a 20-minute presentation, but I hope that it helps you understand a little bit. Tomorrow night, I'm going to talk about a different layer on that map, and that layer is that what we call historical trauma, because you have two peoples that have experienced this historical trauma and how that has shaped the way that they respond to the conflict. Okay. So, again with the questions, because our time is so limited, please make it a question and not a statement, because we'll have a chance to make statements when we have small group discussions.
Thank you. Appreciate what you shared with us. I just want to ask about language that you use, because I've heard that a lot, that it's a conflict, that it's a war. And some of us here, maybe many of us, I don't know, see it as an occupation and see it as genocide. Could you speak to that, please?
Yes, well, the term genocide has a different meaning in how it's used politically and how it's used legally. Okay? And So the determination as to whether or not there is a genocide occurring is determined by the International Court of Justice under the specific provisions of the Genocide Convention. And that analysis is ongoing. That there's no doubt whatsoever that there have been war crimes by both sides. And on the other hand, the determination, the specific determination of genocide has to be legally determined by the International Court.
What about occupation?
Occupation, well, the International Court of Justice has recently ruled that the occupation is against international law.
Criminal. It's an apartheid.
So, that again, that's an ongoing thing.
Thank you. Call it what it is.
So you said right here that Israel is a hybrid sovereignty within the pre-1967 borders. What exactly do you mean by hybrid sovereignty? I don't believe.
Well, I'm referring to the fact that you have to consider what's happening within Israel's borders. And within Israel's borders, the Palestinians are citizens. They actually have representation in the Knesset. Not a lot, but they do it. But within the occupied territories, they don't. And Palestinian citizens of East Jerusalem are not citizens of Israel. So that they really don't have citizenship. Right? They're permanent residents.
It's an apartheid. It's one land apartheid. That's one of the Israeli human rights.
Not particularly helpful.
Question here. Hi. Since we cannot comment, I'll just turn my comment into question. First of all, you're saying that the conflict is not over 100 years old. It is over 100 years old. What we're witnessing today is continuation of all preceding 1948, and now we're witnessing a continuation of Nakba. But the other thing I want to turn it into question, you said that the Zionist movement is a political movement. It is not a political movement, it's ethno-colonial apartheid movement between the current state.
No, actually what I said was that when the British were negotiating with the Zionists, at that point it was a political movement.
They never negotiated, Balfour, 1917, was declaration, was a letter by the foreign minister at that time to Roosevelt, and he promised him to give him a state for Jewish people, take it from Palestine.
Thank you.
They basically gave, homeland for Jewish people, for a whole indigenous people to be displaced and to be, ethnically cleansed, and it's continuing until now.
Well, I think that's kind of what I said. Well, maybe, let me say that that's what I meant.
Okay. Let's say what you think.
One final question.
Final question?
So when we started this, we all acknowledge and recognize that we are on native land. And so if we were to go back in time and look at the struggle of all the different tribes that are here, we wouldn't have called it a conflict. We would have called it a genocide because that's what they went through. So why is the word conflict constantly being thrown around when it's obvious, it's for everyone to see that it's a genocide? I mean, why is the word conflict being used?
Well, it's one of the many terms that are given to what's happening. It's war. Is ethnic cleansing?
What else?
Is displacement? There's lots of terms that you can put to it. I'm just saying that when you use genocide as a rhetorical term to make your case, it's different than when an International Criminal Court of Justice makes that determination.
It's accurate.